Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sarah Ransom. I'm the Partnerships and Impact Lead from the Australian Water Partnership. We'd like to welcome you today to our webinar. We have a role here in AWP, and this is work which I support, which is in supporting our knowledge sharing function. So we'd really like to welcome you today for our webinar, which is entitled Planning for Resilience to Improve Water Security. This is the second episode in a series of AWP webinars in the lead up to our annual Partners Workshop on the 4th and 5th of August, which will be on the topic of water security in a changing world. As you may be aware, the Australian Water Partnership is supported by the Australian Development Program through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But of course, any views expressed during this webinar don't necessarily represent the views of the Australian government. In the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, water and community. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So we'll just move into some general housekeeping. First, we're going to hear from our range of wonderful speakers, and then we'll move into a Q&A session. So I'd really like to encourage everybody who's joined us today to submit your questions. You can type those into the Q&A box there in your Zoom control panel. My colleague Lucia will be monitoring the chat box and interacting with you there, and she'll bring the questions forward for us. If you have any issues with audio, please also use the chat, and we'll try as best we can to help you out with that. Live captioning is being provided as well. There'll be a link in the chat, so you can click on that if that's a service that you would like to use. And finally, on the housekeeping front, the webinar is being recorded and we'll share it afterwards, along with the presentation and the key messages. So onto our webinar today. Our objective in this webinar series is to provide a platform for exchange of knowledge on some of the key current issues in the water space. We're highlighting some work of AWP partners through this exchange, but we're also bringing experts from elsewhere to provide different points of view into the discussion. Today's topic is around resilience, and that's something that's key to everything we do here in AWP. Through our overall goal of supporting sustainable water management, we help to build resilience on a number of levels at the community, watershed, in food security, etc. So building on the previous topic of our webinar 2 months ago, which was around climate change in the Pacific, our speakers today will be looking at the issue of resilience and its relationship to climate change and water. So next, I'll just briefly welcome our speakers. First of all, we have Paul Mitchell, who's the Principal Climate Change Advisor for Save the Children Australia. Paul's going to talk to us today on climate adaptation and development and its links to resilience and water security. Next, we'll have Dr. Fernanda Adame, who's a research fellow at the Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith University. And she'll be speaking today on wetlands as an asset for climate security. Leila Macadam will be next. She's a water engineer and a project manager at the International Centre for Environmental Management. She'll be speaking on valuing water through nature-based solutions. Dr. Lachlan Guthrie, a project manager in integrated water management at WASH at the Australian WaterCentre at Griffith University, will be speaking next. And he's talking today on water's role in the pandemic response and recovery. And finally, Kathryn Silvester will be joining us, and she's the Resilience and Climate Change Adaptation Lead at Sydney Water. She'll be speaking on strategic improvement of water security. So I'd like to move on to Paul Mitchell, who'll be setting the scene for us. Paul, if you can put your camera on. Paul Mitchell is Save the Children Australia's Principal Climate Change Advisor. He's a technical lead for Save the Children's engagement in climate change programming and the Green Climate Fund, With over 15 years of experience in climate change and development in government and non-government organisations, Paul has developed, implemented, monitored and evaluated adaptation projects and strategies at local, national and regional scales across the Pacific, South and Southeast Asia, Africa and the Caribbean. So Paul, I invite you to talk for us. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, thanks, Sarah. Thanks so much. And Michael and everyone at the AWP for inviting me along to chat. My task is to set the scene. It's a really big scene. So we'll see how we do. Well, let me see if I can control this slide. There we go. So look, I've got 7 minutes and 7 points to make. So let's see how we go. This will be a very broad brush overview of all things climate and a little bit of water. And because of course you'll be hearing a whole bunch more about water from people who know a whole bunch more about water after me. So broad brush. So 7 points. First thing that I wanted to say is that something that I always say every time I speak to anybody ever is that climate change is not only a challenge for the distant future. It is absolutely a challenge for the distant future, but it is already a significant challenge and having significant impacts. We know it's getting hotter, indisputable. You can see from this graph that, you know, it's almost a linear projection. The last 5 years are the hottest 5 years, and we've been seeing that for a while now. Most alarmingly, 2020 was tied with 2016 for the hottest year ever recorded since industrialization. And the thing about 2020 was that it did not have an El Nino driving that heat as it did in 2016, which was an unusually strong El Nino year, which escalated that temperature above what it may otherwise have been. So we're literally seeing the climate signal in action now. We also know that the sea levels are rising and that the rate of rise is increasing significantly over time. So it's getting faster and faster, which has all kinds of implications, both immediate and much longer term. We know that extreme weather events are getting more extreme, and some of them are becoming more frequent. We're seeing more floods, more droughts, more weather-related events, and all of those in one way or another are linked to water. So that's point one. How am I going for time? Not so great. Point two, we don't have all the answers yet, but the trend is increasingly clear and it is increasingly alarming. We've been, you know, looking at this for a long time. We know indisputably that human actions are the cause of the temperature increases we are seeing in the Earth and their associated impacts. We also know that we're seeing a fundamental shift in the climate in which we live and we experience, and it is completely different now and will be increasingly different over time from the climate in which the entire history of human civilizations have existed over time, to the point where a lot of scientists now don't talk about the Holocene, the period in which human evolution occurred. They now talk about the Anthropocene, which is the human epoch, where we are having a fundamental impact on our planet and everything associated with it. Okay, point three, we know that climate change is a global problem and it requires a global solution. There's nothing, we can't stop this problem. No country acting alone can really do enough to drive down the emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases to the point where the problem will go away. But we know that the impacts of climate change are really local. I mean, really, really local. We're talking, you know, if we're talking in the Pacific, a place where I work quite a lot these days in Vanuatu, the impacts of climate change and extreme weather can be fundamentally different on two sides of the same island, you know, let alone between Vanuatu and Bangladesh, for example. But we know one thing that holds true is that everywhere it's the poor and the society's most vulnerable people are hurt first, are hurt worst. It's children, it's people living with a disability, it's women in many places, it's other socially marginalized groups that cop these impacts first and cop them worst over time. We can see that, for example, on this map, which is just the general political map you would all be familiar with, colored to GDP per capita. So the darker the color, the darker the purple, the richer the country. But if we take that map and we change the size of the country based on the number of people that are currently, or when the map was made a couple of years ago, at risk from extreme weather events, it changes things pretty fundamentally. If it gets there, hopefully that's coming through. And you can see, I mean, obviously China has a massive population, India has a massive population, but they have massive populations that are fundamentally at risk. And other countries with much smaller populations are outsized when you look at a map this way. Places like Vietnam, places like Cambodia, parts of the Pacific, big chunks of sub-Saharan Africa all swell in size vis-a-vis their population because they are so at risk to adverse weather events and the impacts of climate change longer term. So point 4, you know this, we've been talking about this literally for decades and seemingly nothing has been changing. And there are probably a bunch of reasons for that, but vested interest is certainly a good place to look when things are stuck. But things are changing. Second last point. You know, the question now is not whether things will change, but how quickly they will change and how equitably we will drive that change. So we know that more and more countries are signing up to achieve this mythical net zero by somewhere between 2040 and 2060. We saw a big upsurge in commitments coming off the back of the climate summit that the new president of the US, Joe Biden, recently held. We've seen a whole bunch of regions, particularly, you know, including California, which is one of the biggest economies in the world, bunches of cities. I went to update this slide yesterday and I had to increase every single number on this slide. More and more cities, more and more businesses, universities, investment groups are increasing their commitment to reducing emissions. We're seeing a huge swath and growing interest in things like nature-based solutions, which are almost entirely water-related. We're seeing an upsurge in interest in setting of a global adaptation goal, which is something we've never seen before, and a really strong acknowledgement of the fact that we can't avoid impacts of climate change anymore. We absolutely need to reduce global emissions and in many places and in many ways. But even the best case scenario, the impacts are really extreme and are already being felt. And a new emerging idea of this of locally led adaptation, which is a drive to make sure that what we're doing about climate change on the adaptation side, we're doing in place rather than kind of taking a national or a regional view, which fundamentally leaves out the people who are most vulnerable and most at risk. I think I'm basically out of time. Last 2 points, getting onto the topic. When we talk about climate change, we're talking about water. Fundamentally, climate and water are inextricably interlinked. We can't attain food security if farms are flooded or crops are dying from lack of water. We can't attain water security if our water infrastructure is constantly being damaged and destroyed by increasingly fierce storms. So these are the things we need to think about. And when we're thinking about water, we also need to be thinking about climate because, and my last point, is that we have absolutely no hope of achieving our water-related sustainable development goals or any kind of water security in almost anywhere on Earth if we don't address the climate crisis. And vice versa, we can't address the climate crisis without addressing the water crisis. I think I'll stop because I ran over. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Paul, so much for that overview. You've given us a somewhat frightening, but I think quite realistic view of what the climate situation is looking like from your work and development programs. And thank you for that. It's a really good scene setter for us because it brings out some of the links between resilience and I guess broader climate adaptation and the scale of the need and challenges there. So thank you. We'll move on to our next speaker, who's Fernanda Adame from the Griffith University here in Australia. Fernanda's research is focused on measuring biogeochemical and ecological processes associated with ecosystem services of wetlands. Specifically, she investigates the ability of wetlands to mitigate nitrogen pollution, sequester carbon, and protect coasts. Fernanda works collaboratively with government agencies, NGOs, traditional owners, and community groups to identify cost-effective ways to protect, restore, and manage these beautiful ecosystems. Fernanda, if you've got your camera on, great. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for logging in to this talk and for inviting me. So as Sarah has said, I've been working in wetlands for the past 10 years, or probably a bit more. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is about the potential of having wetlands as assets for mitigating climate change and also for improving water quality. Oh, sorry, I think I'm having trouble with this. Can I just get to the second slide, please? No, before.
Fernanda, just go ahead, we'll find a slide.
Yes, can you please control it from your side?
Yeah, we will, thank you.
Yes, just from, yeah, there, please. The second slide. Yes, thank you very much. So as you know, Paul told us we're facing various environmental challenges. And one of this, there's like two challenges that we've already kind of went over the top of, like the thresholds of being in a safe space. And one of them is biodiversity loss, and the other one is a disruption of the nitrogen cycle. And then the third one will be climate change. And I'm going to talk about how we could use wetlands for mitigating actually the three of these challenges. The disruption of the nitrogen cycle is mainly due because of like farming, agriculture and aquaculture activities that produce the use of fertilizers that cause excess of nitrate, ammonia, and also nitrous oxide emissions. And then the greenhouse climate change is caused by in the greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. Next. So wetlands were one of the solutions that could help us improve the resilience of water and climate resilience are wetlands, and that's one of the reasons that I've been so interested in working in this space. So wetlands are very good, first of all, at sequestering carbon because they're very productive ecosystems, and they not only include sequester a lot of carbon in the plant, in their biomass, but they're also in their soil, accumulating and retaining carbon for millennia. They're also very good at removing nitrate from the water through this process called denitrification, in which nitrate is converted by bacteria in their soil to nitrogen gas. Also, it has actually been documented that some of these wetlands are even nitrous oxide sinks, which is something that you rarely find in nature. So the good news is that a lot of these services have been starting to be taken into account in market schemes, and they're actually being evaluated and resulting in financial compensations for people that conserve or restore wetlands. As an example, we have the nitrogen mitigation scheme, like reef credit scheme in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. We also have a lot of carbon projects that have been done around the world. There's also multiple benefits that you would even get for restoring or conserving wetlands, even if they don't have markets yet. So, for example, we have coastal protection, fisheries productions, biodiversity, and other cultural and spiritual values. Next. So I'm going to talk about very briefly about two projects that I've been working on. One of them, as I explained to you, is in the Great Barrier Reef, and it's about using wetlands to reduce nitrogen pollution. So what we found is that wetlands have been a very important role in removing nitrogen from the water. For example, in this picture that you can see here is a catchment of the Great Barrier Reef that it's, as you see, beautifully, covered in wetlands. And these catchments have the potential to remove 70% of the nitrate that they receive only after 1 day of flooding. This potential of wetlands can be really high for improving water security, for improving water quality in any region around the world. Next. The other example that has to do a bit more with carbon is about also being interested in work with the emissions projected from mangrove loss and how can these emissions be offset. So the carbon markets work in a way that you have to have an action that reduces projected future emissions. So what we've done is calculated the drivers of different emissions from around the world. This is a place that I've worked in before, which is the Caribbean. And here we found that we could create about 200 teragrams of CO2 equivalents by the end of the century. However, if we stabilize the coast, we protect mangroves and we restore mangroves affected by tropical storms, we could decrease those emissions and get offset credits for it. Next. So overall, we have one of a cost-effective solution for improving the resilience in the coastal zone that will improve our water quality, will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and also will provide us a number of other environmental services for the benefit of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. That was really fascinating, and so many potential applications of your work there, which I'm sure many of our participants today will ask some questions about when we get to the Q&A session. So next, I'll ask Leila Macadam if you can put your camera on. Leila is a water resources engineer and project manager at the International Centre for Environmental Management with an office in Hanoi. She works with multidisciplinary expert teams and governments to incorporate climate resilience and ecologically sustainable development approaches within river basin management. Leila's technical background is in floodplain management with a special interest in integrated assessment and modelling to support water resources management decision-making. And I'll hand over to you, Leila.
Thanks very much. So hi, everyone, and thanks for having me today. So I'll be talking a bit about the benefits of nature-based solutions like wetlands for climate resilience and water security, and importantly, some tips to get them integrated into your planning and investments. So to me, nature-based solutions are very much about tackling root cause issues and not just the symptoms that are contributing to water insecurity. So let's start with a little field visit together. So say your expertise has been requested by the Department of Water Resources. You've gone out to take a look. You're in an area that experiences agricultural drought. And maybe the request is for a better irrigation supply. And you might see some flood destroyed infrastructure like this weir up on the right-hand side. Obviously, damaged infrastructure like this is a further threat to water security and the desired infrastructure. So later in the visit, you continue on to an urban area, the two photos at the bottom, and you know that there are drainage issues here. You see situations like this, development up to the side of the road, minimal opportunities for directing runoff. You know that they have some flood problems here. So thinking about our fundamental problem, is it just too much or too little rain that's causing this flood or drought situation, this water insecurity more broadly? Or can we take a step back and look across space and time and consider the root causes driving this increased risk? So the approach that we try to take and in incorporating nature-based solutions is to look at the functioning of the watershed as a whole and consider how does nature itself mitigate the impacts of very high and very low rainfall to maintain health and to maintain the ecosystem services to the community. And so how can we then build on that in our design solutions? So within a healthy watershed, you can imagine that the forested upper catchment areas capture that rainfall, help to store it and infiltrate into the soil, recharge to the groundwater. And then that water is more slowly released downstream across time. But what we're finding increasingly and also contributing to all of our climate change issues is that we have so much degradation of our forests and catchment areas and big damage to this vegetation cover. And as a result, we ruin this balance. So we have less water stored and infiltrating in the upper catchment areas. And instead, we have higher peak flows running off into downstream areas and contributing to flooding. So with this increased intensity of runoff, we're losing our water. And so, of course, that is also contributing to our drought risk. So not only do we have this flood and drought risk to be concerned about, but it also does actually damage our infrastructure investments that we've already made. And you can also look on the top 2 photos. You can see the highly erosion risk stream banks there, and the very muddy water, all that sediment flowing off into downstream areas, building up in reservoirs, reducing storage capacity, reducing the lifespan and efficiency of those investments. So this degradation is really having widespread issues, and it's increasing the cost to us in maintaining infrastructure, as well as the costs of disasters, as well as all of the human suffering of flood and drought, etc. So when we are asked to resolve or come up with some design solution for this, taking a nature-based approach, we can think, how can we build on that existing natural mechanism to rebalance the availability of water across space and across time? How can we strengthen that existing mechanism, whether it's by reforesting upland areas, by improving vegetation cover, by adding meanders back into rivers? These are all nature-based approaches. So IUCN defines nature-based solutions as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems to address societal challenges effectively and adaptively. So this is providing benefits both to humans and biodiversity, and that's a really exciting concept. So nature-based solutions is a bit of an umbrella term. It's associated, other related approaches that you might have heard of include bioengineering, green infrastructure, water-sensitive design, ecosystem-based adaptation. There's a whole suite. Now, we know that nature is not single purpose. Fernanda just described so many different benefits and functions of wetlands, for example. So for water security, we are mainly focused on nature's functions to increase infiltration and storage capacity in the upper watershed area, improve water quality, reduce erosion, control sedimentation, and to retain soil moisture for agriculture in particular. And of course, nature-based solutions provide the parallel benefits of increasing biodiversity. And this then provides other types of benefits like habitat for fish, traditional medicines, alternative food sources, non-timber forest products that can contribute to livelihoods, and of course, carbon sequestration to varying extents. Now, these benefits are on top of those protective mechanisms and potential disaster risk reduction, and also on top of any benefits to reduce maintenance costs for downstream infrastructure, like water, pipe systems, roads, for example. So with all these benefits, you can imagine that on a multi-criteria analysis or a cost benefit of various solutions to a given challenge, nature-based solutions can score really well. However, often projects are designed with a hard infrastructure solution already in mind. So we may experience pushback with our partners, but we do have options, and we can be that champion of such nature-based approaches to provide such a wide range of benefits, contributing against not only our water security challenge, but so many other societal benefits as well. So at ISAM, we have been working with local and national governments in Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Mongolia, all with current projects relating to planning and piloting of nature-based solutions, and also hybrids of nature-based combined with more conventional grey infrastructure.
Leila, this is your time warning. Sorry to butt in.
For 2 minutes?
1 minute to go.
1 minute? Okay, thank you. So here are a few photos from a pilot in northern Vietnam. And this is piloting nature-based solutions to bank stabilization. And this is drawing from local materials, plants, traditional knowledge, and using local person power with communities to actually construct these as well. So some of the benefits we found here is that nature-based solutions are lower cost to establish, they can be more easily maintained and repaired by local communities. They tend to have a lower risk of catastrophic failure in the first place compared to a highly engineered approach. And they also have great job creation potential, which is another popular topic in our COVID Building Back Better times. Nature-based solutions also have potential to be gender inclusive, provide those benefits back to local community and vulnerable populations and get them involved in the construction and maintenance, as well as the use of the plants and whatever, traditional medicines, etc., food sources that they might also provide. So just a few final tips in terms of working with your partners. It's really important that we get nature-based solutions on the table with our partners and that we champion them as options. Not everyone is familiar with them, so I highly recommend that you look at the resources on the final 2 slides, so you can be that person to put them on the table and explain some of the many benefits that can come with a nature-based approach. It really does require a cross-sectoral approach, and that can again be something that you need to fight for, is to get all of the right departments around the table relating to land use, relating to urban development, relating to forests and protected areas. It is really important to have an integrated approach and get as many people involved as possible to champion, mainstream, and align the policies to support these types of solutions. Obviously, demonstrations are really important. People believe what they see. But any grey infrastructure investment discussion, for example, provides a really fantastic approach to integrate some nature-based solutions and provide these other parallel benefits. And a final point on this is that nature-based solutions are increasingly required to access global climate financing. And so this can be a really powerful incentive when you're discussing with partners and governments about their broader infrastructure planning and water security situation. So you can find a few more references and resources on these last 2 slides. There's a 20-minute version of this presentation, more or less, that you can find on the ISAM website. And as well as resources in a range of languages that you can look at if you want to incorporate such approaches in your own work. So I really encourage you to include nature-based solutions in your water security toolkit and include them in all your discussions with partners on project design and investments. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Leila. I'll just remind everybody that we will distribute the slide pack for the webinar in the following days. So if you're interested in following up on some of those resources, they'll be available for you there. Thank you, Leila. That was a fascinating presentation, and again, you drew out some of the issues there that we've been looking at throughout this webinar so far, around some of the design challenges that come from working at a very local scale and working with natural processes on such big and challenging global issues. So next, I'd like to introduce Lachlan and Guthrie. Lachlan, if you can turn your camera on. Great. Lachlan is a research fellow and project manager in integrated water management and WASH at the International WaterCentre at Griffith University. He has extensive experience in integrated water strategic planning and water security, and recently compiled a water security and COVID-19 risk index, which was supported by AWP, based on the Asian Water Development Outlook. Lachlan has been working to help countries review their risk to COVID-19 from the perspective of water security. This work highlights the critical role water plays in vulnerability to the pandemic, responding to it, and rebuilding economies. Over to you, Lachlan.
Thanks for that, Sarah. I think I have control of the slides. It doesn't appear I do. Could you change to the next slide? Thank you. Yeah, so as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about 2 different projects, the Asian Water Development Outlook and a COVID-19 / Water Security Vulnerability Index. Both of those projects were funded by the AWP, and so it's just really a pleasure to talk about them today. Next slide, please. So the first of those projects is the Asian Water Development Outlook. And so this is the Asian Development Bank's flagship water security report, which we released the most recent iteration of in 2020. And it evaluates 49 countries in the Asia Pacific region across 5 key dimensions of water security. You can see those 5 key dimensions there. Yeah, I won't go into the methodology behind this, but through this project and another project, which I'll talk about in a second, I've just sort of compared the findings of the two. Next slide, please. So second project here, COVID and Water Security Risk Index. And so here we used a risk-based framework to evaluate how water interventions could best alleviate or help with COVID response and recovery throughout those 49 countries in the Asia Pacific. We created a really nice web interface for this one as well, so you can follow the link there to find it. So as I mentioned, I'll be talking about these two projects. And what I noticed was that the vulnerabilities regarding water security, they were largely just made a lot worse by COVID. So those vulnerabilities were already existing, and so I'll talk about them both in unison. So next slide, please. So the first and most pressing vulnerability that comes across all of water security is climate change. So other people are going to talk about this a lot more throughout this presentation, so I won't talk about it too much. But essentially, the reason that climate change makes such a huge stressor on populations is because it increases the competition between different sectors. And so this is really important moving out of the pandemic, particularly as we'll see an increase in the importance of agriculture, both in providing food security where trade has been disrupted, and also to provide economic recovery where tourism has been disrupted. And so this means it's vital to ensure that vulnerable groups, particularly rural households, have the ability to still claim that water that they need so desperately. Next slide, please. So the second vulnerability is HR capacity. So I mean, human resource capacity. So this is both the capability of people, so the education levels, and then also the number of people, the sort of people you can throw at a project. So both of the nature-based solutions that Fernanda and Leila talked about earlier, they are going to require a workforce, a competent workforce that can actually implement these innovative green solutions. And that's really what we need to train throughout Asia. We need to make sure that there is a workforce that are trained in these new skills and that there's enough of them. So we do know that water service plans in general fail because of their implementation, and a high reason for that is the lack of human resource. So the vast majority of countries in Asia do not have the human resources requirements to meet their current water and sanitation servicing plans. And we're going to really need to understand the different trade-offs between water sectors and how things like green infrastructure can improve different elements of the water sector in one project. Next slide, please. So data availability. So this is a really key issue and something that's experienced by all indexing methodologies. So I'm sure you've all heard the saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so currently there are really huge gaps in safely managed water supply and sanitation in most of the countries throughout Asia. So of those 49 countries, there was only 7 reporting safely managed sanitation, and there was even fewer reporting hygiene access. So the reason that this is a problem is we don't actually know how we're going with the SDGs. And this is so much so that the Jeffrey Sachs SDG dashboard report that's released recently, it doesn't even use the SDG target of safely managed as the indicator of reporting on safely managed sanitation. So it's really quite an issue that's experienced across many countries, not just in Asia, and it's what we need to be targeting. So you see governments, because safely managed is not reported, you'll often see governments just targeting that at least basic level of sanitation, which really leaves a concerning lack of fecal sludge management. So we knew throughout most of the pandemic that hand washing and social distancing were two key policies that were promoted by public health people. And those are both dependent on water services. You obviously can't wash your hands if you don't have soap and water at home. And it's very difficult to isolate at home if you don't have access to water at home or a toilet. And so the lack of data meant that it was very difficult to plan and prioritize between different regions inside a country, in knowing which might be at more risk. Next slide, please.
Hi, Lachlan, just to let you know, you've got a minute left.
Yep. And so the last here is just the Pacific. And so what is really concerning is that in all aspects of these vulnerabilities, they're worse in the Pacific. And you've seen the Pacific's water security really stagnate over the last decade or so. You've got tourism-dependent economies which will need greater funding. The government won't have access to as much money as they did before, and climate change impacts we felt much more drastically. The Marshall Islands, the main atoll of the Marshall Islands, the highest point on that atoll is actually 3 meters above sea level. So when you're talking about sea level rise of 1 to 2 meters, that's a significant portion of land. Also things like sanitation management becomes much more difficult when you've got saline and higher groundwater tables. And then further, the capacity development really needs to incorporate local water knowledge here and ensure that the Pacific can be provided with a sustainable water future. Next slide, please. So that was all I had for you today. I'm very happy to field any questions that come up in the chat, and at any time, if you want to discuss more, there are my contact details there. Thanks AWP for the opportunity to talk. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Lachlan, for that really interesting presentation. It's really, really nice to hear about the detailed work that you've done there on resilience from the perspective of COVID and water risk there. And again, some threads you drew out there, which I think were prominent throughout our presentation so far around particular impacts on vulnerable groups and that other sort of set of human factors around capacity and the importance of local knowledge as we look at solutions to some of these issues. Now I'll ask our final speaker to turn on her camera. Kathryn Silvester has joined us. She works in resilience and climate change adaptation at Sydney Water. She leads complex programs of work, including water conservation and drought planning, to ensure that Sydney Water anticipates, prepares and adapts to changing circumstances, including longer-term challenges associated with climate change. Kathryn is currently the International Water Association Australia Chair and IWA Fellow, and completed her Master of Integrated Water Management this year, where her final thesis assessed how climate change could impact household water supply resilience in Kota Bekasi in Indonesia. Kathryn, please take the floor.
Thanks very much for having me. I'll just make sure I can change the slide. Oh, here we go. I think that should work. So thanks very much for having me. So I'm going to talk about resilience and climate security. I just wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land as well, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So just for a little bit of context, Sydney Water provides water and wastewater services for about 5 million people across Greater Sydney. And we also provide some recycled water and stormwater services as well. Most of our potable water or our drinking water is sourced from dams, but we also have one desalination plant which can service about 15% of Sydney Water's drinking water demand. And so I acknowledge that the context and scale in Sydney is quite different to the Asia Pacific region, but we're facing some similar challenges, and I think there's a real opportunity for learning, and you know, we're going through some similar thinking, so it's a great opportunity to be here and hear about the work that's going across the region. So as we've already talked about, the past doesn't reflect the future, and so we've got a changing climate. We can't look at the past to think about what we're going to face next. And a really great example of that is the 2017 to 2020 drought that the Greater Sydney experienced. We had record low inflows, unprecedented storage depletion rates, and our total storage reduced by over 50% in about 2.5 years. And you can see in that graph that I'm showing here the difference between the millennial drought, which is a really large period of dry weather that occurred across the country, compared to what we saw in Greater Sydney in that last drought. And that steepness of that dotted line shows how quickly the drought progressed. It wasn't as long as the millennium drought, but we lost our storage, declined very, very quickly. And so when it rained in February, we had a chance to rethink and consider how can we be better prepared for the next drought, because we know it will occur, we just don't know exactly what it would look like. When we talk about resilience at Sydney Water, we talk about the 5 R's of resilience. And so thinking about how do we get more resilient in terms of our water security, we can kind of pull it apart and think about resistance and the ability to withstand and prevent threats, hazards, shocks and stresses. So in the terms of, in the context of water security, this could be having a treatment plant that can treat a range of water quality and provide that safely to our customers. Reliability is that capability for infrastructure to meet obligations under a variety of conditions, and that's having a sufficient maintenance program and ensuring that we don't need to take off critical assets offline during periods of drought. Having the redundancy, so adaptability to meet obligations with the loss of an individual component, and that could be a new supply source, a climate independent supply. The response is being prepared for and taking actions during an adverse event to limit that impact. So I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. And recovery is restoring function as quickly as possible to limit damage caused by the failure. And that is also inclusive of capturing those lessons learned and reassessing how we can respond and what we need to be doing to increase our resilience moving forward. So I think it's really useful to consider those different elements of resilience and what kind of combination of these, because the sum of the parts will increase our overall resilience. So at the moment, Sydney Water is working with Water New South Wales, which is the bulk water supplier in Sydney, to think about to develop a Greater Sydney drought response plan. There's 2 key objectives of that plan. Is defining when and what drought response measures to trigger in order to safely maximise water resources available, and who and how, thinking about the effective and efficient management of prolonged dry weather leading to drought conditions. So that's that governance. How do we manage drought as we progress from normal operations into preparing and responding to drought? And because we know that each drought is going to be different and it's going to be progressing at a different rate, we need to be really flexible in how we prepare for and respond to drought, because in some periods we may need to react very quickly, and in others we can take our time and be more measured in how we make those decisions. So we need to develop a plan that provides that flexibility, but also provide guidance and thinking about what kind of lead and lag indicators do we need to be monitoring. When do we start triggering from that normal operations to that preparedness, to thinking about what kind of committees do we need to be starting up, and who is making those key decisions in terms of taking that next step into responding to drought. So having a really good plan and a flexible plan that can adapt to the changing conditions is really going to help us in terms of being more resilient. So I guess I just wanted to leave you with that thought about the 5 R's and how we can be more resilient. You know, there's always that push and to build another climate independent supply and another desalination to increase that water security and water resilience, but we also need to balance that up with the cost that comes to our customers, and also the impact on the climate, because those sort of pieces of infrastructure are highly energy intensive. And so if we can be better prepared and defer and delay those sort of decisions in a time that it makes sense, we can reduce that impact and reduce that cost, and maybe wait until there's a better technology available that can provide a new water source that at a lower carbon footprint as well. So I'm really interested in the discussion to come now. I think we've had some really great speakers and a lot of good thought starters, but that's it from me. So I'm interested in your questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. That was a really interesting insight into how Sydney Water approaches some of the big variability and change issues that it's faced and will continue to face over the near future. Thank you very much for your presentation. So we'll move on to the Q&A session now. If I could ask all of the speakers to please turn your cameras on again. And I'll just also remind participants, we've had a couple of questions come through already, but please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom there, and we'll do our best to feed them up to the presenters. So I wanted to start off the conversation, I guess, with a question of my own, if I could. And this is one for Fernanda and Leila in particular. I'd be interested in your views on what resilience means. We both spoke about ecosystems. So the question is around how does your work in building the financial case for valuing nature, how does that sort of feed into the question around resilience and ecosystems? So, Fernanda, can I ask you to start off there?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Well, as Leila was saying, like nature-based solutions are one of the most, they're not just cost-effective, but they're also resilient. In one of the main thing about them is that they can change, and they can change by themselves. They can adapt. Let's say mangroves can grow and accumulate and start moving landwards as the sea level rises. While if you put like a wall, it will just stay there and it will not move by itself. So there's a lot of arguments of why nature-based solutions are better than gray solutions. And one of the things that is interesting, that the one thing that is changing is that now we're finally incorporating the values the ecosystem provide us into our markets, which is something that's really has never been done before. So having a financial, so we know that constructing a wetland might be cheaper than constructing like a barrier, like a wall, but also the fact that you can actually get paid in credits to support this ecosystem services, it really has increased enormously the appeal for many governments or smaller communities to adopt these green solutions.
Thank you, Leila. Did you want to answer that?
Sure. Thanks so much, Fernanda, for that great response. And I think that's such a beautiful point that with nature-based solutions, you know, nature is adapting and strengthening over time. And so the functions that are being provided through nature-based solutions are also strengthening over time, in contrast to a more hard engineering solution whose lifespan is actually, you know, decreasing and degrading with climate change. Of course, not every nature-based solution is, you know, itself fully climate resilient per se, but there is a much higher likelihood that you can design something that will be, and yes, highly adaptable in comparison. So in terms of the cost, the business case for nature-based solutions as well, I will just mention one of ICEM's current projects in partnership with the CRC for water sensitive cities, which is supported by AWP and the World Bank, which is looking at case studies in Vietnam and Thailand to apply economic valuation of nature-based solutions. And I know my colleagues are very excited to share some results from that a few months from now, so please have them back for that. And I think that, you know, that can be very meaningful for some people, for governments, for, you know, the Ministry of Finance, who is looking to choose where they're going to invest. So that economic valuation of ecosystem services and of the benefits of nature-based solutions are really important. But at the end of the day, you do really want to be building on what stakeholders are valuing about their ecosystems and what services are being provided by the ecosystems that water is supporting. And, you know, if you can build the business case and really focus it around what those services are that are important to the stakeholders in the area, then, you know, I think that can be equally meaningful to putting a number on it when it comes time to prioritize between different options. Thank you.
Thank you both. I might jump to Paul just for another question. I guess while we're on the topic of valuing and making the case for certain types of solutions to come into the mix with policymakers and at the global level. Paul, I wondered if you might be able to comment on an aspect of your work that you haven't touched on yet, which is around following the international sort of climate negotiations, and offer us some comments on, I guess, the increased interest that we're seeing through the UNFCCC negotiations, and that's in the lead up to the COP26 in Glasgow this year. So increased interest there in water.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I guess I sort of touched on this a little bit when I mentioned the fact that we've been talking about this stuff for decades and nothing seems to change. But I mean, I think things are changing. I think the nature of those negotiations or those conversations is changing over time. And I think the biggest shift and why we're now seeing such interest in issues like water in the negotiations specifically is because of the growth in interest in adaptation more broadly. So for the longest time through those negotiations, I mean, right back from day one, the focus was very much, and justifiably so, on mitigation, on reducing emissions, right, to solve the problem. There's people who work on adaptation often say that the best form of adaptation is rapid mitigation, right? So we can kind of prevent the need for future adaptation. But because we're in this context in which countries, companies, etc., have repeatedly made commitments that weren't ambitious enough and then repeatedly not met those commitments, we now know that no matter what we do from here, even if we shut down everything this minute, turned off all the lights, shut down all the emissions generating activities, we'll still see and already are seeing extreme impacts over time. And those impacts will grow significantly before the climate gets a handle back on itself and stabilizes, even if we were to shut everything off now. So that kind of recognition of the fact that we are now, it's not an either or conversation anymore. We can't mitigate our way out of it only now. We also need to have significant investments in adaptation. So that growing interest and that growing recognition, I think, is driving negotiators, policymakers, governments around the world to start thinking much more clearly about issues of adaptation, which always intersect with water issues. So this year, fingers crossed, the negotiations go ahead in Glasgow as planned, but the world is in a bit of a funny state still, so we'll see what happens. But the UK government is driving an incredibly ambitious agenda at the negotiations and really leading from the front with some really ambitious announcements and kind of new commitments themselves. But they have what they're calling campaigns, 5 key issues they want to focus on in the negotiations, and 3 of them are very closely related to water. So one is adaptation and resilience, obviously, looking at people and systems. So that kind of the idea of strengthening or building the resilience of systems and infrastructure to manage the impacts of climate change. So obviously there's significant overlaps with water infrastructure there, but also, resilience of people. We know that people who are healthier, who are wealthier, and who are better educated are inherently more adaptable and able to manage the impacts of climate change. And again, water comes into that very, very closely. The second one that comes across water is nature-based solutions, which we've just talked about. There isn't a nature-based solution that I can think of that isn't water related. We've had Leila talking about nature-based solutions really clearly, Fernanda as well, looking at how we manage some of these impacts through natural processes by enhancing those, or at least not undermining them any further. And then the last one that is relevant is finance, right? And that's an enabler of transformation across anything you want to do these days. If you don't have the funding to back it up, it can't be done. I think water people out there should be watching this year's negotiations really, really closely and engaging with policymakers beforehand to make sure that when we're talking about adaptation resilience, when we're talking about nature-based solutions, when we're talking about finance, we're also talking about issues around water availability, water quality, and everything else to do with water in the most local context as possible. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Paul. That's really interesting, and you've drawn up some threads there. A number of our panelists have spoken about their work in building the information base and the case through data and research to then sort of hopefully influence policies and decision making down the line a little bit. I just wanted to bring a question in from one of our webinar participants. This is from Peter, and it's open to any of you who's interested. Again, on this question of how do we measure and how do we value water and these nature-based solutions. The question for any of the panelists: how do you, in your roles, account for elements of resilience that aren't easily measurable? For example, people's different and possibly clashing values and perspectives regarding water. I might go to Lachlan. Would you like to have a go at that one, and then we'll ask other panelists?
Yeah, so, well, thanks for that, Sarah, and thanks for the question. It's a really good question. So in my work, it's very, very high level, looking at a wide-ranging policy. So it's actually quite difficult to integrate feedback from the field. I think that's really important and really should be the genesis of any of our messaging that comes through an international policy. Policy from the national level. We need to target our policies to help those that are most vulnerable. So when I'm working on sort of indexing stuff and then looking at prioritization, the questioner makes a really good point that different communities have different values, and those are really difficult questions to answer. For example, how much grain is worth the life of a child dying from diarrhea, and those are the questions that you really need to ask when talking about water security, comparing agriculture to obviously household water security there. So with my work, it's really important to be very transparent and giving people the opportunity to be able to interrogate that work and potentially change those assumptions.
Thank you, Lachlan. That's a great point that you raised there at the end around transparency and the importance of engaging with communities when you're doing the work that informs the policy. Kathryn, I wonder if I could ask you a question next, which is again sort of, I guess, going back to this issue of how do we grapple with, I guess, the difficulties inherent in so many potential variables in the work that we're doing. We spoke a little bit about this, but I wondered if you might be able to talk about in your work how you go about strengthening knowledge of future scenarios so that the decision makers can then grapple with the trade-offs that we're facing.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think in the context of drought and rainfall, we have some good models or scenarios in terms of that longer term, but in terms of the short term, it is quite challenging, and there's a little uncertainty in terms of how much rainfall we'll expect in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. We know that longer trend, there'll there'll be more and there'll be less in terms of more extreme wet weather events, but less rainfall in the drought context. And so I guess what we need to do is be more flexible and adaptable and think about how can we be better equipped to respond to those different types of scenarios. We know that drought will occur again. We know that we'll have flood events. We'll know that there's going to be disasters that we need to be more resilient towards. And so I think what we're doing at Sydney Water is thinking about how do we transition to be more resilient. So it's not something we need to do in one fell swoop. We can take the opportunities as they arise. So if an asset is due to be upgraded, can we think about, you know, how we can, instead of just a like for like sort of replacement, what do we need to do for that asset to be more climate resilient, thinking about the flood levels and what sort of design considerations we should be thinking about in the life of the asset rather than just the financial NPV sort of scenario. So I think it's that taking the opportunities as they come, being flexible and adaptable, and then thinking about what are we trying to be resilient against, so that if there's lots of different scenarios where a certain piece of infrastructure or nature-based solution can, I guess, lead us towards being more resilient to the multitude of scenarios, then it's almost like a no-brainer. So if you sort of pigeonhole or very narrow looking and just looking at one type of drought scenario, and what you would build to address that kind of a scenario, then you're missing out at that broader holistic context. So I think we need to be a bit broader minded, thinking about a multitude of climate scenarios, a multitude of exposures that different organisations are facing, and what kind of steps we can take to transition to be more resilient, and not sort of be overwhelmed that we need to spend all this money and build all these big things all at once. We can do it in slow little steps, and that's probably a good pathway to kind of show how do we get towards being more resilient, and demonstrate the value there.
Thanks, Kathryn. I might just draw on another question from our audience. This one's for Fernanda. The question is, hi Fernanda, thank you for your excellent presentation. This is from Kathryn. What is your view on the role of constructed wetlands in addressing climate impacts and for carbon sequestration?
Yeah, thank you, Kathryn. I guess, you know, there's one thing that it's important to know is that, well, we have all these services provided with wetlands. There are different wetlands provide different things. So not every single wetland will mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions and remove nitrogen. So for example, constructed wetlands have definitely a role to play in treating, you know, water, especially like in urban centers or in agricultural places where there's no nature, you know, maybe there's not there anymore to kind of provide this water quality improvement. But there are some types of wetlands, let's say like mangroves, that they won't produce any methane because they're intertidal wetlands. But then there'll be other wetlands that might produce a bit more methane because they're fresh water. So that every single type of wetland will provide some ecosystem services, and definitely constructed wetland being just kind of this other type, definitely will have a role as one cost-effective solution.
I might move on to another question that we've had in our Q&A box, and I'll just remind everybody that there's still time to ask questions if you would like to know something from our wonderful panelists. The next question is for you again, Kathryn. The question is from Tony Slatcher. Your graph of the steeper down curve in the 2017 to 20 drought is very powerful, not just for Sydney, but for all cities dependent on large dams. How can this kind of data be used to make the policy and political case for supply diversification and stronger ongoing demand management issues?
Good question, and that's why I put it up, because I think it is really powerful, and I don't think people recognise that at the time how quickly that drought progressed, and the situation that we were in, and the people in the decision-making chair thinking that there was just not enough time to respond, and we're certainly using that piece of imagery or in the Greater Sydney Water Strategy. So that's a piece of work that the local government is developing, thinking about how do we become more resilient and being in a better position to respond to future droughts. It's a key piece to pull, and it's also that using the millennial drought and also the 2017 to 2020 drought as different scenarios. I mean, I know I said that we can't keep looking backwards because the future doesn't necessarily reflect the past, but at least being able to communicate with our policy and decision making people in government that these are things that did actually happen, and if we were to continue on those trajectories, we would have run out of water in this many years. It takes this long to build another supply source. What are we going to do about it? And sort of give it's a more tangible feeling of that risk, instead of, I think that's one of the challenges with resilience and getting resilience funded is that a risk that's already been realised, or what's the likelihood of this occurring, is something that people really get caught up on. And so being able to demonstrate that this has happened, and yes, it did rain, but if it hadn't rained and the drought was to last a few more years, we would have been in a very different position. So we're certainly trying to use that imagery to communicate the situation we were in. But it is challenging. We don't want to scare the public. We don't want to make people feel too worried about the future. You know, it's that balance of this is the situation we're in and we have the opportunity to do something about it now, and when's the right time to make that decision, so that we're not increasing the costs to people, especially the most vulnerable customers. We don't want to be significantly increasing bills by building lots of infrastructure so it's that balance that we're working through at the moment with local government as well.
Thank you, Kathryn. We have another question. This one came in before the webinar. It's from Katrina from Civic Ledger. So this is an open question. We might just go around the table and see if there's any thoughts from our panelists. What solutions do speakers propose to enable local communities to agree on the value of water and the methods for its sharing? If such solutions involve water information and associated data, how can it be accessed by all, and how can it be trusted and transparent? Would anyone like to have a go at that one?
I'll jump in first. I think it's a super good question, and it's really complicated. The work that Save the Children does in the main is in places that still often operate on certain aspects of traditional knowledge or traditional governance approaches, and sometimes that is in conflict with more current ways of managing resources, science-driven or science-based approaches. And we find, you know, there are sometimes conflicts there, and there are often complementarities, and making sure that, you know, we always take a participatory approach, that we make sure that we're listening to people because they are the best ones who understand their needs and wants, and then feeding into that, though, information that may not otherwise be readily available, climate and weather information, for example. So bringing the best available climate information and climate science into discussions with communities, very participatory, making sure we're meeting with and talking with all of the various kinds of people that exist in a community, and bringing along their perspectives and then matching them up with some of what the science is telling us. And that can be at odds with what people are experiencing. Things might seem just fine right now, but we know, like the frog in the boiling pot, that, we may not see evidence necessarily of things getting steadily worse in a linear way, but suddenly we can jump to a new state. And so figuring out how to bring that kind of information into those local contexts and meet people where they are and talk about these issues is really, really critical. And then finding ways to sustainably input that information. We always often work on project-based approaches, right? So we have an amount of funding for a certain period of time and we can do some stuff, but then we leave, and what do we leave behind? And I think building those locally appropriate, locally contextual systems and processes that enable people to continue to undertake participatory planning processes and access locally relevant climate information over time is really critical. And it's not at all straightforward. I don't think we've figured out how to do it properly yet, but it will always involve government of some kind and may potentially involve private sector providers, depending on the context, but it's really complex, and I don't think we have a good answer. We have some examples of where things have worked, but whether they're sustainable in the long term, I think is always an open question.
Thanks. I'll just open it to any of the other panelists who'd like to comment on that question around working with local communities to value water.
I might just add one extra thing there. So one thing that we know from what the research is telling us, that if we don't do the engagement with local communities, it just doesn't work. Infrastructure solutions alone, hard infrastructure solutions alone, just don't work. And so I think we really, as water practitioners, we really need to recognise that it's not just a nice to have thing for engaging with communities. It's a vital, crucial, probably the most crucial element of a water infrastructure project.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that from my side, which most of the stuff that I do is like pretty scientific, it's like biogeochemistry and like that kind of thing. But all my projects, they have this like interaction with like I work with farmers, I work with like traditional owners. I work with the Queensland government. So every project that we have, it's from the design, it's like includes all these people, so we can come up with some result together that at the end everybody is happy with. So it incorporates everyone's opinion. So at the end, if we come with a result like, oh, these wetlands are really good for removing nitrogen, but these ones are very good for the birds. So everybody like will take on that information and will be happy with whatever management action is done afterwards because they were part of it. So in my perspective, in like including all these people in science has been very effective at communicating and merging all these different types of knowledge.
And just building on that as well, thank you for those good answers. So yeah, I mean, I think we're lucky to have so many good tools these days for, participatory work with communities at different scale and, stakeholders at different scales. I think it can also be interesting and valuable to talk with communities about, what are the indicators in their own environment that kind of have implications at the watershed scale or are influenced by other factors at the watershed scale, so that they can kind of contextualize their own situation in the broader situation as well. So I know that SM has previously developed like a watershed health report card in some of the Irrawaddy in the past, and that has had a community component of them identifying their local environmental indicators, whether it's plants or fish or things that they use, and how that's linked to the watershed more broadly, so that they can also develop their own kind of indicator systems and build that awareness. But you know, equally, there's plenty of local communities that are already very aware of that, you know, rumors about upstream hydropower impacts, for example, and, you know, whether they aren't influencing their own irrigation water supply, you know, it's always being discussed. So exactly, I think the important thing is to really use all of those good tools to engage and work and discuss with communities, because everyone can be a bit, you know, understanding of their upstream and downstream implications in that context. So I'll just give a shout out to one of our partners, eCraft, under the World Agroforestry banner. They have a talking toolkit that has lots of fantastic tools for working with communities in that way on these natural resource topics.
Thank you. We'll share that link if you can send that through to us. I'll just hold to see if there's any further comments on that question before we move on. I think we have time for one final question.
Oh, sorry, one more thing, just on that question of data sharing. Another thing that's been very popular with our projects recently is developing, you know, web-based GIS data sharing platforms, you know, similar to the interactive platform that Lachlan has with the COVID-19 risk. You know, increasingly we're developing similar types of tools specific to a certain location, showing that geospatial data that everyone could come and look at, and that can certainly be a way to increase that transparency and have everyone feel like they, you know, are sharing and understanding that knowledge for that transparency as well. Sorry, last thing.
Thank you. We might just move into, we've had 3 questions on governance come through. I'll just read them out, and again, we'll go around the table and see if anyone would like to comment on those. So the first one is from Clive Lyle, who's wondering if the panel would like to comment on governance and policy approaches. Hemant Ojha has also asked a question regarding governance. He's wondering about panelists' insights into facilitating the uptake by governance systems of all the solutions that have been proposed. He's asking this question because good solutions have long been ignored by decision makers and even catastrophic levels of risks. And the final one of this group is from Kathryn Broderick. Thank you for your excellent presentations. There are big challenges and there are big opportunities for change. What are the qualities for adaptable governance in climate change scenarios? And how far away are we from having appropriate governance? Lachlan, would you like to jump in and go first on that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think that what we were talking about just before in terms of a bottom-up engagement is an important consideration for any future governance, where in the water sector does appear to be moving away from the top-down IWRM approaches used throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. And so I am quite confident that we're moving into better, more decentralized governance models. As I see it, one of the main inhibitors to decentralized governance and in essence better governance is capacity and capability. So we need to make sure that decision makers understand water and understand different technical solutions, and then when they have people coming to them, they can make an informed decision. We also need to make sure that they have the data available to them to make those really informed decisions as well. So I guess in essence, for me, it's really about learning, knowledge, capacity building, and then also having extra data and better data.
Any other panelists who'd like to comment? Kathryn?
Yeah, I can kind of follow on there. I mean, it's a bit of a different context, but thinking about the drought response plan and the governance around how we respond to drought, what we learned and what was some key. I've been interviewing lots of people about the last drought, which has been really fascinating, and having clear roles and responsibilities, getting that buy-in before we're in that responding to drought. So having the plan in place, having decision making at different levels, so abilities for the technical and the operations to come in and inform those decisions, or to pull levers where if there's issues and problems. So having the governance set up to then incorporate the different technical people, different decision levels, bringing together the policy and the technical together is really important. Having those clear roles and responsibilities, having clear guidance about when decisions need to be made, who's responsible for them, is also really important, but also having that flexibility so that they can then adapt from the plan or make a different decision or go down a different pathway if that's the best outcome, because we don't know what the future will look like, and so we want to give the people in those seats the best information to then make the decision. So it's having that flexibility, but as guidance and yeah, data, good data to help inform those decisions.
Additional responses there from our panelists?
Maybe just to add a couple of quick points on that. I think it's really important that to ensure that we don't try and govern in silos. I mean, we can, right, but it doesn't work. And the two issues we're talking about today, water and climate change, are perfect. You can perfectly attempt to manage a water resource without ever thinking about future climate, but you'd be bonkers if you did. So I think that's really important to kind of to make sure that we're thinking about these things as a part of a system. So that's the one thing. And just on Lachlan's point, I think it's exactly right. We need to do a lot more governance from the bottom up, but I think we also have to acknowledge that there are some real attractions to top-down approaches, and sometimes they're effective. But I think often what we forget about is how to make them meet in the middle. How do we utilize bottom-up information to feed into some of those necessary kind of top-down approaches. And then the last thing, I think, building on Kathryn's point, is we have to, I think, always have an eye on no regrets approaches. We need to do things that make sense now. And, if climate change turns out to be a giant hoax, put over the world by nefarious climate scientists looking to make millions of dollars, that still makes sense, but also work across a range of possible climate futures. We know, as Kathryn said, we don't know exactly what the future will look like, but we do have a sense of the direction of travel, and the width of the banding, depending on so many other factors that are outside any particular decision maker's control. And how do we kind of do things now that make sense in a murky future? That's more questions than answers, sorry.
No, that's a perfect point at which to start wrapping up, actually, Paul. In our webinar series, we're trying to build one on another, and I'm sensing that there might be a bit of interest in this topic of the bottom-up and the top-down meeting in the middle, the sort of the more governance side of the question. So we might look into that for our next webinar, which will be in about 2 months' time, I expect. I'm just going to stop us there because we're very close to time. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Paul, Fernanda, Leila, Lachlan and Kathryn. You've done us a wonderful service by sharing your knowledge and your experience and giving us your time. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I really thank you for that. I'd also like to thank our participants. We're really excited to have the opportunity to provide these webinars, and we're so grateful that you're making time to listen. I'd also like to say thank you to Shannon Lee and Lucia Gamara, who are my colleagues at AWP, put a huge amount of work into making this happen, so they're behind the scenes. I wanted to say thank you to them. For anybody out there who's interested in learning more, we'd love to hear from you. We have a contact email address which is contact@waterpartnership.org.au. Feel free to send through any questions that you have there. For our AWP partners who are online, just a final plug for we'd love to see you in Canberra in August at our annual partners workshop, and more information will be coming out about that. So finally, just to remind you to stay in touch with us at AWP. You can visit our website, waterpartnership.org.au, and subscribe to updates there. And we're also very active on social media, so you can follow us on your favourite social media. A final thanks to all our panellists and the participants. It's great to see you, and we'll sign off. now. Goodbye.